In the quiet coastal town of Clearwater, Florida, life often moved at a slower pace than in the bustling cities to the north. The year was 1992, and the town was a place where neighbors greeted each other in the mornings, local fishermen still brought in their daily catch, and most families knew one another by name. The streets were lined with modest houses painted in faded pastel colors, with front porches where residents would sip coffee as the sun rose over the Gulf of Mexico. It was in this setting, on the warm afternoon of April 18, 1992, that Robert Callahan and Margaret Maggie Callahan exchanged their wedding vows. Robert was 42 at the time, a man of routine and quiet determination. He had served in the U.S. Navy for nearly 2 decades, retiring early to take a job as a maintenance supervisor at a shipyard just outside of town. He was known among his colleagues as reliable, sometimes to a fault, and among his friends as a man who rarely spoke more than necessary. His upbringing had been strict, his father a former police officer, his mother a devout Catholic, and his moral outlook reflected the conservative values of his childhood. Maggie, on the other hand, was 35 when she married Robert. She was warm, attentive, and quick to smile, with a calm manner that made her well liked by the women at the local church and the neighbors who often saw her tending the small garden in front of the couple's home. She worked as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm in town, and while she did not speak much about her past, no one thought it unusual. Maggie seemed to fit seamlessly into the rhythm of Clearwater life. The early years of their marriage were, to all appearances, steady and uneventful. They attended church together on Sundays, hosted occasional dinners for friends, and took short vacations to nearby beach towns. People saw them as a quiet, dependable couple, one that had chosen a simple life over the chaos of ambition or restless travel. The only thing that stood out over the years was that they had no children. At first, neighbors assumed they were simply waiting for the right time, or perhaps that they were unable to conceive. By the mid-2000s, however, when Robert and Maggie had been married for more than a decade, people stopped asking. It became a silent fact of their lives, something not discussed openly but quietly noted. Behind closed doors, the absence of children had been a recurring topic in their marriage. Robert, who valued family traditions deeply, had always hoped to have at least one child to carry on his name. Maggie's explanations were gentle but firm. She claimed medical complications, insisting that motherhood simply was not possible for her. Robert, though disappointed, accepted her reasoning at face value, trusting her words as he always had. Their life went on. They celebrated anniversaries, cared for an aging dog, and slowly grew into the kind of couple that seemed inseparable. The years slipped by, and by 2022 Robert and Maggie had been married for 30 years. Robert was now 72, his hair silver and his posture slightly stooped, though his eyes still held the same quiet sharpness they always had. Maggie, now 65, retained much of the calm, gentle presence that had first drawn Robert to her. The two of them still lived in the same house they had bought shortly after their wedding, a 2-bedroom cottage with pale blue siding and a wraparound porch that overlooked a small, well-kept yard. To outsiders, theirs was the picture of a long and enduring marriage, proof that commitment could weather time. Yet beneath the surface, a subtle undercurrent of restlessness had begun to grow in Robert. His thoughts increasingly returned to the life they might have had if children had been part of it. At night, when the house was still, he found himself wondering why Maggie had never sought medical treatment, or why they had never considered adoption. He told himself it was too late to dwell on such things, but the questions persisted, lingering in the quiet spaces between their conversations. In early 2023, something shifted. Robert began to notice small inconsistencies in Maggie's stories about her past. A casual remark about her childhood would not match what she had said years earlier. Documents in their home office seemed to have been moved, and certain old papers, ones Robert vaguely remembered, were no longer there. He dismissed these as trivial at first, the forgetfulness that comes with age. But the unease they caused was undeniable. What Robert did not yet realize was that these small details were cracks in the carefully constructed life they had built together. Cracks that would soon split wide open, exposing a truth neither of them could have imagined when they stood together at the altar 3 decades earlier. By the spring of 2023, Clearwater had changed in ways both subtle and obvious. New shops had opened along Cleveland Street, a few old businesses had closed, and younger families were moving into the neighborhoods that once housed retirees. But Robert and Maggie Callahan's life seemed largely untouched by these shifts. Their days followed a pattern so consistent that neighbors could almost set their clocks by it. Robert would wake up at 6:15 each morning, even though he had been retired for nearly a decade. He would brew a pot of strong coffee, pour Maggie a cup, 2 sugars, no cream, and set it on the kitchen table before taking his own mug to the porch. Maggie would join him 15 minutes later, wearing her thin blue robe, her hair neatly brushed back. They would sit quietly, sometimes reading the paper, other times just listening to the distant sound of gulls over the water. It was a routine neither of them ever discussed, yet both seemed to depend on. Their social circle was modest but steady. On Wednesdays, Maggie attended a women's Bible study group at St. Mary's, while Robert met a few former Navy colleagues for breakfast at a diner on the edge of town. On Sundays they sat in the same pew, third from the back, left side, and chatted briefly with other congregants after the service. Most people who knew them described them as the solid kind of couple, the type who didn't argue in public, didn't draw attention, and seemed quietly content. Yet there were subtle signs, if one looked closely, that the Callahans' marriage was built on more silence than conversation. Robert was not a man who spoke about feelings easily. His way of showing care was through actions, fixing a leaky faucet without being asked, keeping the yard trimmed, changing Maggie's car oil before the service light came on. Maggie, in turn, was affectionate in small, deliberate ways. She made Robert's favorite meals on his birthday, ironed his shirts before Sunday service, and kept the house organized to his liking. But when it came to deeper subjects, dreams, regrets, fears, they rarely ventured there. It was as if both had quietly agreed to keep certain doors closed. Over the years, Robert had asked in passing about Maggie's family. She had told him they were not close, that her parents had died when she was in her 20s, and that she had no siblings. She explained that she'd moved to Florida from a small town in Georgia after her parents' deaths, looking for a fresh start. The story was always delivered in the same gentle tone, and Robert never pressed further. He respected privacy. After all, he had things from his Navy years that he never spoke about either. The one subject that had occasionally stirred tension was children. In the first years of their marriage, Robert had asked several times about the possibility of starting a family. Maggie would smile softly, sometimes take his hand, and explain again that she had medical complications from an illness in her youth, making pregnancy impossible. She never gave many details, but her quiet conviction left little room for doubt. Over time, Robert stopped asking. Instead, he told himself they were simply meant to enjoy each other's company, that there were other ways to build a meaningful life. But in recent years, Robert found himself more aware of what was missing. When he saw younger families in the neighborhood, children riding bikes, parents cheering at soccer games, he felt an ache he couldn't quite name. Maggie, for her part, seemed unchanged. She poured her energy into keeping their home spotless, volunteering at the church and tending to her garden. If she noticed Robert's growing quietness, she didn't mention it. By early May 2023, the couple's daily life was disrupted only by minor inconveniences: Robert's occasional back pain, a leak in the roof after a storm, Maggie's persistent cough that she brushed off as allergies. They had just celebrated their 31st wedding anniversary with dinner at a small Italian restaurant by the beach. The evening had been pleasant: soft music, candlelight, a shared slice of tiramisu. On the surface, they were the same couple they had always been. Yet beneath that calm surface, a shift had begun in Robert. It was subtle, an extra beat of hesitation before he answered certain questions, a longer pause when he looked at Maggie across the breakfast table. Something had taken root in his thoughts, though he couldn't have said exactly what. It wasn't suspicion, not yet. More like an awareness that he knew less about his wife than he had always assumed. It was during these quiet mornings and ordinary afternoons that the fault lines in their life began to spread, too small to see, but deepening all the same. Neither Robert nor Maggie could have predicted that within a matter of weeks, their decades of shared life would unravel completely, and that the truth, once exposed, would make the 30 years they had spent together seem like an elaborate illusion. The first real fracture in Robert's trust came on the morning of June 6, 2023. It began as an ordinary Tuesday. The Florida sun was already bright by 8 a.m., casting sharp light across the kitchen floor. Maggie had gone to her Bible study early, leaving Robert alone in the house. He planned to spend the morning cleaning the garage, a task he had put off for weeks. It was the kind of quiet work he preferred: sorting old tools, stacking boxes, deciding which things to keep and which to throw away. The garage was cluttered with 30 years of accumulated belongings. Fishing rods Robert hadn't used in a decade, boxes of Navy memorabilia, Maggie's gardening supplies, and stacks of sealed cardboard boxes marked only with black marker. Most of the labels were vague: kitchen, winter clothes, books, remnants from their last move in 1993. Robert opened them without much thought, sorting items into piles. Near the back, under a dusty canvas tarp, Robert found an old cedar trunk he didn't remember owning. It was heavy, with tarnished brass hinges, and locked with a small latch that didn't require a key. The moment he opened it, a faint scent of mothballs and aged paper filled the air. Inside were neatly stacked folders, some brittle with age. He recognized Maggie's handwriting on several envelopes, dated from the late 1980s. At first, Robert smiled faintly, thinking he'd stumbled on old love letters or photographs. But as he flipped through the contents, the smile faded. There were no wedding mementos, no family photographs, only documents, birth certificates, medical records, and one in particular stopped him cold. It was a birth certificate issued in 1958 for Michael James Whitaker. The name was unfamiliar, but the date of birth matched Maggie's exactly, August 14, 1958. Robert's brow furrowed. His first thought was that it belonged to a distant relative. But the place of birth, Athens, Georgia, was the same town Maggie had claimed as her own. His hands tightened around the paper. He set it aside and continued looking. The next item was a set of medical records from a clinic in Atlanta, dated 1978. The language was clinical and precise. Gender reassignment surgery completed successfully. Patient formerly identified as male. The name at the top had been typed as Michael J. Whitaker, but was later crossed out in pen and replaced with Margaret Whitaker. Robert's breath came shallow. The paper trembled in his hand. He read the line again and again, his mind struggling to process the meaning. He felt as though the air in the garage had thickened, making it hard to breathe. For a long moment he simply stood there, staring at the documents spread out on the trunk. Memories flashed through his mind, 30 years of shared life, of intimate conversations, of quiet mornings on the porch. All of it overlaid now with this new, unshakable fact. His wife, the woman he had loved and trusted for decades, had once been someone else entirely. Not just someone else, but someone of a different gender. His first reaction wasn't anger. It was confusion. How could she have kept this from him for so long? Why had she never told him, even in their most private moments? He thought of the years he had spent wondering why they had no children, of her vague explanations about medical issues. It all fit now, but in a way that felt like betrayal. Robert sat down heavily on an overturned crate, the papers still in his hands. He stayed there for nearly 20 minutes, staring at the documents without moving. He could hear the distant sound of a lawnmower down the street, the hum of summer insects, the faint creak of the garage rafters. But inside his head, there was only a roar of unanswered questions. When Maggie returned home just before noon, Robert was still in the garage. He had placed the documents back into the trunk but left it open. She walked in, smiling faintly, holding a paper bag from the bakery. "I got you those cinnamon rolls you like," she said, setting the bag on the workbench. Her eyes flicked to the open trunk, and in an instant, the color drained from her face. Robert saw the change and felt something harden inside him. "Maggie," he said quietly, his voice flat. "What is this?" He gestured toward the trunk. She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze moved from the documents to Robert's face, and she took a slow breath. "It's my past," she said finally. "Something I never thought I'd have to explain." Robert stood, his voice tightening. "Your past?" "Your past says your name was Michael James Whitaker." Maggie's lips parted, but no words came. Her eyes glistened. "Robert, 30 years," he interrupted, his voice rising. 30 years and you never told me?" Maggie's hands trembled. "I was going to once, but then, I was afraid. Afraid you'd see me differently. Afraid you'd leave." Robert stared at her for a long moment. "You didn't give me the chance to decide." The rest of that day passed in a strained silence. Robert said little, retreating to the porch while Maggie stayed inside. The cinnamon rolls sat untouched on the workbench, the bakery bag slowly collapsing in the summer heat. For the first time in their marriage, the air between them felt not just tense but dangerous, thick with something that couldn't be smoothed over with quiet words or time. Robert didn't yet know what he would do. But something fundamental had shifted. The life they had shared was no longer the same. The trust he had once taken for granted was gone, replaced by a gnawing, restless weight in his chest. And in the days that followed, that weight would grow, pushing him toward a decision from which there would be no turning back. For the next several days after discovering the trunk, Robert moved through the house like a man walking on unstable ground. He kept his words short, his eyes sharper than before. Maggie tried to resume their usual routines, making coffee in the mornings, asking about his errands, but each conversation seemed to trail off into silence. It was as if both of them knew that the life they'd built had shifted irreversibly, but neither could decide what came next. On the morning of June 9, 2023, Robert decided he couldn't leave it at just the documents. A lifetime in the Navy had taught him that facts needed to be verified, that records could be faked, and that trust was something you built only on proof. He waited until Maggie left for her Thursday volunteer shift at the church thrift store before pulling the cedar trunk from the garage into the living room. This time he read every document slowly, methodically, placing them in order by date. The medical records were clear, signed by surgeons and stamped with official seals from an Atlanta clinic in 1978. There were also name change documents filed in 1980, legally changing Michael James Whitaker to Margaret and Whitaker. A Georgia driver's license from the early 1980s bore Maggie's current face, though younger, framed by shorter hair. Robert noticed the dates and realized Maggie had moved to Florida just a year before they met. Robert's next step was to take the documents to someone who could confirm their authenticity without alerting Maggie. He called an old Navy friend, David Rourke, who now worked in private security. They met the following afternoon at a small diner off U.S. Highway 19, far from Clearwater. Robert brought only copies of the papers, keeping the originals hidden. David looked over the documents quietly, his brow furrowing. "These are real," he said finally, sliding them back across the table. "I've seen this kind of paperwork before. The seals match. The timelines make sense. Whoever Maggie was before, she's been legally Margaret for over 40 years. Robert's jaw tightened. "She never told me. Not once. Not even when I asked about kids." David hesitated, choosing his words. "Some people hide parts of themselves because they're afraid of losing what they have. Doesn't make it right, but you've been married 30 years, Rob. That's a long time to keep a secret." Robert said nothing, but the words lodged in his mind. A long time to keep a secret, too long. When Robert returned home that evening, Maggie was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. She looked up when he came in, her eyes searching his face for a trace of the man she had known. "You've been quiet," she said softly. "Nothing to say," Robert replied, moving past her to wash his hands. He didn't want to start a confrontation, not yet. Instead, he resolved to learn everything he could before deciding what to do. Over the next week, Robert began a private investigation of his own. He used his old military contacts to pull archived public records from Georgia. He found school yearbooks from Athens High School, where Michael Whitaker appeared in the class of 1976, tall and broad-shouldered, with features Robert could now see mirrored faintly in Maggie's current face. The resemblance was unmistakable. He also located a faded newspaper clipping from 1980 about a legal name change petition in the Clark County Courthouse. The article was short, just a notice in the public records section, but it was enough to confirm the timeline. The pieces fit together too well to be coincidence. Each new fact Robert uncovered only deepened his sense of betrayal. The woman he thought he had known had been living under a different truth all along. The more he learned, the more he replayed their conversations over the years. Moments when Maggie could have told him, moments when he might have understood. But she hadn't trusted him with the truth, and that realization burned more than the secret itself. Maggie seemed to sense the widening distance between them. She avoided bringing up the documents, as if pretending they had never been found might undo the damage. But Robert noticed the way her eyes followed him when he left a room, the way she hesitated before speaking, as if weighing every word. They still shared a bed, but Robert now lay awake long into the night, his back turned, staring at the faint glow of the clock on the nightstand. On June 14th, Robert made one last call, to a man named Frank Holloway, a retired police detective who had worked in Georgia in the late 1970s. Frank was slow to answer at first, his voice gravelly over the phone, but when Robert explained who he was and the name Michael Whitaker, the line went silent for several seconds. "I remember that name," Frank said finally. There was nothing criminal about the kid, just a lot of talk in town back then. Folks didn't understand. Some treated it like a scandal. He left Athens right after the legal changes. Never came back as far as I know. Robert thanked him and hung up, his hands cold despite the Florida heat. There was no crime in Maggie's past, nothing that explained why she had kept this hidden for 3 decades. It was purely a matter of trust. Or rather, the absence of it. That night, Robert sat alone on the porch, watching the streetlights flicker on. Maggie came out and stood beside him, holding 2 mugs of coffee. She set one down on the table between them. "We can talk," she said quietly. "If you want." Robert didn't look at her. "I think I've learned everything I need to know." She didn't respond. The silence between them was heavier than any argument. And for Robert, the quiet was no longer peaceful. It was the sound of something breaking, slowly but beyond repair. By mid-June 2023, Robert believed he had pieced together the full truth of Maggie's past. She had been born Michael Whitaker, undergone gender reassignment in 1978, changed her name in 1980, and moved to Florida shortly after. But something about the story still didn't sit right with him. The secrecy was one thing, hurtful, yes, but there was a precision to the way Maggie had hidden it that suggested more than simple fear. It felt calculated. That feeling sharpened on the morning of June 20th, when Robert went back to the cedar trunk for the 3rd time. He had already reviewed every document more than once, but this time he decided to inspect the lining of the trunk itself. Years in the Navy had made him cautious. He knew that important things were sometimes hidden inside the most ordinary objects. He found it under the false bottom, 2 slim manila folders bound together with a brittle rubber band. Inside were photocopies of court transcripts from 1984, stamped with the seal of the Fulton County Courthouse in Georgia. At first, the contents were difficult to make sense of, but as Robert read, the meaning became painfully clear. The case involved a man named Harold Price, who had accused Margaret Whitaker of fraud. According to the testimony, Maggie, then in her mid-20s, had entered into a romantic relationship with Price without disclosing her transgender history. When Price discovered it, he claimed she had deceived him into marriage under false pretenses. The court had dismissed the criminal charges, ruling that there was no legal requirement for such disclosure, but the civil suit had ended with Maggie being ordered to pay a settlement. Robert felt his throat tighten as he read the final pages. The transcripts revealed heated exchanges, with Price accusing Maggie of building a life on a lie, and Maggie insisting she had acted out of self-preservation. There were also mentions of friends and acquaintances testifying about her ability to adapt her history when needed. It was the word adapt that lodged in Robert's mind. He thought back to their life together, how Maggie had been so careful with her words, how her stories about the past had always been just detailed enough to seem real but never open enough to invite deeper questions. He began to wonder if their entire marriage had been just another adaptation. That night, Robert said nothing to Maggie about what he had found. But his manner toward her changed subtly, the warmth in his voice replaced with a measured formality. When she asked if something was wrong, he replied, "I'm just thinking about things." The unspoken fact hung between them. He was thinking about her, and about the possibility that the woman he had loved for 3 decades had built their life together on the same kind of omissions she'd once used with someone else. In the days that followed, Robert began going through their shared life with new eyes. He looked at old photographs, scrutinizing her smile, the tilt of her head, wondering what was genuine and what was part of a carefully maintained image. He replayed conversations from years past, especially the ones where he had brought up children. Her answers had always been gentle but never detailed. Now those moments seemed like deliberate evasions. On June 25th, while Maggie was out shopping, Robert made another decision. Using his friend David Rourke's connections, he obtained a copy of Maggie's original marriage license from her brief union with Harold Price. What startled him wasn't just the fact of the marriage, it was the date. Maggie had married Price in 1983 and finalized the divorce in late 1984. She had met Robert less than 7 years later. 7 years wasn't long, not for the kind of reinvention Maggie had pulled off. It meant that when Robert had fallen in love with her, she was still within living memory of her last marriage, and the public scandal it had caused in Georgia. That night, Robert confronted her. The conversation began quietly at the kitchen table. "I found something," he said, setting the court transcripts in front of her. Maggie's face went pale. She didn't touch the papers, just stared at them as if they might burn her fingers. "You knew about these," Robert continued. "You knew what happened with Harold Price. And you still didn't tell me." Maggie's voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't tell you because it was over. It didn't matter anymore." "It mattered to him," Robert said sharply. "And it matters to me. Because now I have to wonder if I was just the next man you didn't tell the truth to." Maggie's eyes filled with tears, but there was a firmness beneath them. "I loved you, Robert. I still do. What happened before you, it was a different time. People were cruel. I was trying to survive." Robert leaned back, his hands flat on the table. "Surviving's one thing. Building 30 years on a secret is another." The conversation ended there, both of them too drained to continue. But in Robert's mind, something irreversible had clicked into place. This wasn't just about the fact of Maggie's past, it was about a pattern, a history of omission, a habit of letting people believe one version of reality while hiding another. From that night on, Robert's thoughts grew darker. The trust was gone. The marriage felt hollow. And though he didn't say it out loud, not to David, not even to himself, he had begun to imagine an ending that didn't involve forgiveness or even separation. He had begun to imagine an ending that would erase the betrayal entirely. The final fracture came on the evening of July 2, 2023. Clearwater's summer air was heavy with humidity, and thunder rolled far out over the Gulf. Robert had spent most of the day in silence, working aimlessly in the yard, trimming hedges that didn't need trimming, sweeping the driveway twice. Maggie had noticed his restlessness but avoided pressing him, sensing that something in him had reached a dangerous depth of stillness. They ate dinner without speaking. Baked chicken, roasted potatoes, steamed vegetables. Robert ate methodically, his eyes fixed on his plate. Maggie tried to fill the silence with light remarks about the weather and a new hymn the choir was rehearsing, but each attempt fell flat. When the dishes were cleared, Robert stayed at the table, staring at the wood grain beneath his fingers. "You've been quiet again," Maggie said softly, drying her hands with a towel. "If there's something you want to say, you can." Robert looked up at her then, and the weight in his gaze made her pause. 30 years, Maggie," he said, his voice low but etched. 30 years and you let me live in a lie. I can't stop thinking about it. Every day. Every night." Maggie set the towel down slowly. "It wasn't a lie," she said. "It was my life. I just didn't tell you everything." "That's a lie by omission," Robert replied. His tone sharpened. "You took away my choice. You decided what I should know and what I shouldn't. You did it to Price and you did it to me." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I told you, what happened with him was a different time. I was afraid." "Afraid of the truth," Robert cut in. "Afraid I'd leave. Maybe you were right. Maybe I would have. But I'll never know because you never gave me the choice." Maggie's eyes searched his face and for a moment she seemed ready to argue. But then her shoulders sagged and she turned toward the sink. "I can't go back and change it, Robert. I can only tell you now. I'm still the same person you've known all these years." Robert's jaw tightened. "No, you're not. The person I thought I knew never existed." The words hung in the air like a crack of thunder. Maggie's hand froze on the counter. Slowly she turned back toward him, her face pale. "Then what happens now?" she asked. Robert didn't answer right away. He stood from the table, moving toward the garage. She followed him with her eyes but didn't move. Minutes later, he returned with something in his hand, a small, heavy hammer he'd been using earlier for repairs. He placed it on the table between them. Maggie's breath caught. "Robert," she said, her voice trembling, "what are you doing?" He sat down again, his eyes fixed on hers. "I keep thinking about all the years I wasted. All the choices I didn't get to make. I keep thinking, maybe there's only one way to end this." Her hand reached toward the hammer, but not to take it, only to push it away. "Don't," she whispered. "Please. We can fix this. We can." "There's no fixing it," Robert said. His voice was steady now, almost calm, which frightened her more than if he had shouted. The storm outside was closer now, rain beginning to patter against the windows. A flash of lightning lit the room, followed by a deep, rolling rumble. Robert's eyes never left hers. 30 years, he repeated, as if the words themselves were an accusation. Maggie took a step back, her hands raised slightly. "Robert, listen to me. You loved me. You still do. You don't want to do this. but Robert was already moving. The hammer was in his hand before she could turn away. The first blow came fast, catching her across the side of the head. She cried out, collapsing against the counter. He struck again, the sound sharp and final against the wood and tile. The storm outside masked the noise, thunder rolling over the house as if the world itself had turned its back. When it was over, Robert stood over her, chest heaving. Maggie lay still on the kitchen floor, her eyes open but unseeing. Blood pooled beneath her head, mingling with the water that had spilled from a knocked-over glass. For a long moment, Robert simply stared at her. His grip on the hammer loosened and it clattered to the floor. The house was silent now, save for the rain tapping against the windows. In that silence, Robert felt neither relief nor grief, only the hollow certainty that what had been broken could never have been mended. And now it never would be. The final chapter in the tragic story of Robert and Elaine took place on a gray winter morning in 2010, almost a year after the incident that had shattered their peaceful-looking life. The courtroom of the Suffolk County Courthouse was filled with a heavy, almost suffocating silence. Family members, neighbors, and a few journalists sat quietly in the wooden benches, waiting for the judge to read the sentence that would close this case. Robert, now a gaunt figure with deep lines etched into his face, sat at the defendant's table. His once neatly combed hair was streaked with more gray than the year before, and his posture carried the weight of regret, anger, and disbelief. In the months leading up to the trial, his demeanor had shifted between moments of defensiveness and quiet resignation. Despite his confession during the initial investigation, his defense team had argued that the killing was not premeditated but a crime of passion, triggered by the shocking revelation about Elaine's identity. Elaine's family, who had flown in from Pennsylvania, sat opposite him. They were a small group, her cousin Margaret, 2 nieces, and an elderly aunt. They had avoided eye contact with Robert throughout the proceedings, their grief visible in their tense expressions and tightly clasped hands. When the judge began to speak, the room seemed to shrink. The details of the trial had been covered extensively in local newspapers. How Robert claimed that Elaine had deceived him for 30 years, how he said he felt humiliated when he learned she was born male, and how that discovery pushed him into a violent rage. But the prosecution had emphasized another narrative, that Elaine's life had been one of constant fear, always hiding a secret she feared would destroy her marriage, and that she had never intended harm to Robert. The judge acknowledged the complex emotional background but reminded the court that no secret, no matter how deeply felt, justified taking another person's life. Robert was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 2 decades. As the sentence was read, Robert nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if he had been expecting nothing less. Margaret, Elaine's cousin, closed her eyes and let out a long, controlled breath, her hand gripping her aunt's for support. No one in the courtroom celebrated. There was no sense of victory, only a quiet acknowledgement that justice, in its imperfect human form, had been carried out. Outside the courthouse, the winter air was biting, the sidewalks coated with thin layers of frost. Reporters gathered briefly around the family, but they declined to give any interviews. Robert was led away in handcuffs, his eyes fixed on the ground, before disappearing into the waiting police van. For the small town of Hampton Bays, the case remained a haunting reminder that even the most seemingly stable relationships could hide dangerous undercurrents. Neighbors who had once admired Robert and Elaine's long marriage now spoke of them with a mixture of pity and discomfort, unsure how to reconcile the couple they thought they knew with the dark truth that had emerged. In the months that followed, Elaine's headstone was placed in a quiet cemetery in Pennsylvania, engraved with only her name and the years of her life. Few came to visit, but Margaret made sure fresh flowers were placed there every spring. Robert's fate was sealed behind prison walls, where time passed slowly and the days were marked by a routine stripped of purpose. The marriage that had lasted 3 decades ended not with quiet separation but in a single night of irreversible violence, leaving behind a story that would be remembered not for the love it once held, but for the devastating secret that tore it apart.